which are very marvelous teachings. And so today we are doing the teaching on the middleway treatise of Precious Garland. So within this teaching there are 16 factors for higher rebirth, which I will teach today. And then tomorrow, later, there is a part in this text towards the end where it says, may all the negative consequences or results of the negative karmas of others ripen upon me, and may all the good deeds that I have done, the actions I have done, ripen upon others. And so we'll do tomorrow the section on bodhicitta, in other words. So all of us, including my dear friends, even down to the smallest insects, we are all same in wanting happiness and not wanting suffering. So the 7 billion people on this earth, every one of us, there's no need for reasoning out that we all want happiness and not want suffering. So there's suffering that we do not want and happiness we desire. Regarding this, there are two. One based on the sensorial pain and pleasure, sensorial sensory, and the other one is mental. So due to materialistic way of life, the material development is aimed only focused on the physical pleasure. So people who have all the facilities, the material facilities, and also have name and fame, they remain very unhappy. So in this 21st century, of course, the material development has helped us to with the physical pleasure and comfort. Now what we need to do is pay attention to our mind, the inner world of mind itself, mainly. So it's not about religious faith, but we are tossed around by our emotions, and therefore the happiness or peace of mind cannot be produced from factories and from the technological machines. So what we need to do is, by using our own mind, to bring about peace of mind within ourselves. That's the only way. And therefore, usually I say that on the firstly, as a human, I am a human being. And so the 7 billion people on this earth, so I usually express that people, if people could pay more attention to the pain and pleasure that have to do with our mind. And so even scientists are today paying some attention to this. And therefore, historically, the Indian tradition regarding psychology has the most precise and detailed explanation of the workings of mind and emotions. And so from there, the Indian traditions developed, and then Buddhism also came through this tradition of paying attention and studying about mind and emotions. And so there is the emphasis on the practice of love and compassion in the Indian tradition, which is over 2,500 years. And then there is also a study of single-pointed concentration and the analytical meditation, vipassana. So these two practices that are there in the Indian tradition should not be left in the religious realm alone, but we could actually take lessons from that, and in order to tackle our emotions, negative emotions, how to go about with that. And we are not talking about creator God or past and future lives or anything like that, but we are talking about dealing with our emotions here and now. So as a human being, my first commitment is, without talking about any religion, but relating to our psychology, emotions, how to bring about peace of mind. And secondly, as a Buddhist practitioner, of course, there are many different traditions in the world. Though philosophically all these religious traditions may differ, but all teach the same message of love and compassion. And so the philosophical view is something that has to do with the specific disciples or the followers of the different religious traditions. But the main message is that of love and compassion, and therefore there is a basis for religious harmony amongst the different religious traditions. Otherwise, just following the religious traditions as if they are just our customs or habits, and then philosophical differences as well as historical differences cause us to have fightings amongst the religious traditions. So the love and compassion, which are the most important factors within human psyche, though we have this message in all the religious traditions, if we just use the differences and then cause death amongst the religious followers of the religious traditions, this is quite unfortunate. So my second commitment is the religious harmony. So this is possible. If you look at India itself as an example, over the last 3,000 years or so, 2,000 years or so, there have been so many religious traditions in India. Unlike in the amongst the other religious traditions, there are no religious conflicts as such in India for over the last 2,000 years. So all these religious traditions have lived together, coexisted in this land of India. So there are these religious traditions like the Hinduism and so forth, which are homegrown, and then the major religious traditions that have also emigrated to India, such as Christianity, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, and so forth. And so there is a possibility for us to follow religious tradition, religious harmony amongst religious traditions, looking at India, and this is my second commitment. And then thirdly, as a Tibetan, so I have a responsibility over Tibet. Despite that, the political authority or responsibility, I have already devolved from it. I have left that, resigned from it, because we have political leadership which comes through popular, general elections, democratic elections. And so my main concern or the responsibility over Tibet and Tibetans is the Tibetan traditions. So, which is very special. As I said before, the Indian the Indian traditions, which are very marvelous. In the 7th century, during Songtsen Gampo's Tibetan king Songtsen Gampo's time, the Tibetan script was devised newly, and then in the 8th century, Master Chandarakshita, the great abbot, advised Tibetans to translate the Buddhist Indian literatures into Tibetan. So as the translations were carried out from Sanskrit into Tibetan, new words were coined. So there were also words that were already in Tibetan, in use in the Tibetan language, which were those which were helpful and useful were kept, and then new words were coined while translations were carried out. And so the Sanskrit tradition of Buddhism spread in Tibet. So since the time of the Buddha, we have the 3 Pitakas, the 3 collections of the teachings of the Buddha: Sutra, Vinaya, and Abhidharma. And so Sanskrit was the language that was used amongst the real learned of India. So, being the Master Abbot Chandarakshita, having come from the Sanskrit tradition, and particularly the Buddhist tradition, in this tradition of the Nalanda Monastic University, in the Sanskrit tradition, the emphasis is given to using reason and logic. So, of course, we also deal with things that are obvious to us, which are objects of our sensory perceptions. And so on the basis of that, then there is a second type of object of knowledge, which are called slightly hidden or slightly obscure, for which we use reason and inferential logic. And therefore we say, if such and such thing, if A is such and such, then B must be such and such. And therefore, in this Nalanda tradition, the use of the reason and logic has become very important. And so, the study of Buddhist tradition on the basis of logic and epistemology has become very important. And through the inferential logic, then we come to some conclusion, and via that, then we go into the objects which are called very obscure objects, for which we need also to infer. And so the language that we have, the Tibetan language, and so this tradition of using logic and reasoning that we have to explain and demonstrate the truth of the teaching of the Buddha in the Sanskrit tradition is something that even the modern scholars like scientists and so forth are also taking interest in. So this has become very important tradition. So of course in the Nalanda tradition, the Tripitakas of the Pali tradition also were studied, and also the Sanskrit tradition, Buddhist literature in the Sanskrit tradition was studied. So this is from my own experience that after having studied these texts in the Sanskrit tradition, when I have dialogues with other scholars, scientists and so forth, it proves very helpful. So this language that we have, I consider it one of my responsibilities to preserve this language that we have, in which we have the over 300 volumes of Ganjur and Tenjur, the translated words of the Buddha and the translated words and exegesis of the Indian language, from the Indian language, the treatises. So I consider is one of my main responsibilities to preserve this language as well. So we have this custom or the habit in to be compassionate even to insects. The parents and other older people telling young ones not to kill insects and bugs. And so amongst all the religious traditions and Buddhist traditions, we the Tibetans have the most extensive and rich, the richest tradition, the profound and extensive tradition of the Indian Buddhist tradition. So I've been in exile for the last over 60 years. I usually call myself the longest guest of Indian government. And so from India, Buddhism spread to China. So the Indian tradition of non-violence, based on the practice of love and compassion, is something that I consider to be important to preserve to be preserved by the Indians. And so, of course, the modern education was introduced to India by the British. And together with having this modern education, I have found that there has been some neglect on the part of the Indian tradition, ancient Indian tradition, by the Indians. And so, of course, we have the good technological advancement, and together with the modern education in India, on top of these, if we could add, without touching religion, without relating to religion as such, but using the knowledge of psychology, emotions and mind and so forth, if we could revive this in India, of course in the 20th century, Mahatma Gandhi spread that of non-violence, which spreads throughout the world. And on top of this, if we could revive the knowledge of psychology, emotions, mind, and so forth in India, it would be very good. So I also consider it my responsibility or commitment to preserve and promote this, the ancient Indian tradition. So the first commitment is about, related to all beings who don't want suffering but want happiness. And so we need to pay attention to the details of the causality, how suffering and unhappiness and so forth comes about, and how happiness is developed. So we have lots of emotional crisis due to love, hate, attachment and so forth, anger. These must be tackled, and of course in the Indian tradition, in the Abhidharma tradition, for example, there are mentions of the ages of weapons and so forth. So if you look at the world today, and also famine and drought and so forth have been mentioned. So through the material development and progress, what we have done is developed or produced weapons which are used to kill other beings, other people. And so today, if you look at the world, people consider these weapons very important and take much interest in producing them and using them. Whereas there are movements for disarmament and making the world free of nuclear weapons and so forth. So if you think carefully, think closely, there's no way the weapons will solve human problems. This is impossible. So being motivated by our attachment, hatred, and there's no way we can solve the problems of using weapons based on this kind of emotion. So there have been wars and battles in the past, but the world has not been destroyed. Nobody has totally won any battles and wars. In the First World War, people thought of destroying the European nations, and the Second World War, Germany was to be destroyed by others, but it has not been achieved. And then there have been Korean War and so forth. And so these have not been able to obliterate the entire nations and so forth. So we have to live together. There's no way we can actually defeat completely and destroy the other party. And so what we need to do is follow dialogue and discussions when there are differences. So that's the only way. So in order to disarm, in order for the external disarmament to be fulfilled, to be achieved, we need to practice inner armament. And so for that, we need to develop love and compassion, on the basis of which peace of mind within ourselves. So the reason that we can promote love and compassion is that love and compassion is something that is intrinsic into us. This is our nature. If the basic human nature, if we look at a child being neglected at birth by his or her mother, there's no way the child can survive. And so, even animals depend on mother's love and care. And therefore, there's this love amongst the animals as well. And therefore, since it is it has to do with our survival, we need love. So individuals survive So, as individuals, we are reliant on our society. However successful, efficient a person, an individual may be, without a human community, he or she cannot survive. So as human beings, we are social animals. So in the past, people were more or less living in a small community, in small communities, self-sufficient. But today, economic-wise and particularly environmental-wise, the environment actually destruction or the affects the whole of the world. And so the East is dependent for its future to the West, and West to the East, and similarly North and South are dependent on others. And therefore, with the sense of oneness of human being, we need to think about, consider taking responsibility for environmental protection. Think less and talk less about me and my nation, but we need instead think globally regarding environment. Of course, experts say, and then we also have the experience. From my own experience, when I first came here into Dharamsala in 1960, there was a huge snowfall. And then year by year, the snowfall also, there were less and less snowfall. Look at Afghanistan. Of course, it's very barren and desert area kind of. And so in the past, it used to have lots of water, like ocean or seas. And so today, the reality of the world is such that we need to think of oneness of human beings. And therefore, all the problems are rooted in our unruly mind, this undisciplined mind. And so this innate quality that we have, love and compassion, because we have not paid much attention to this, through education as well, and then we develop attachment to one's near and dear ones and hatred and anger towards those we consider as our enemies or adversaries. And so these mental emotions, love, the attachment, grasping, and hatred and anger, all these disturb our peace of mind. And so in Buddhism, we talk about everything being interdependent. Nothing is standalone entity. And so this is very helpful. So as soon as I wake up, I reflect on this nature of thing, interdependence. And then also meditation on emptiness and that of bodhicitta, the spirit of enlightenment, are very important. So self-cherishing attitude brings about suffering, whereas cherishing others over oneself brings about happiness. As Shantideva says in Bodhisattva Charyavatara, all suffering in the world, whatever suffering there is in the world, all come from wishing oneself to be happy. Whatever happiness or joy there is in the world, all come from wishing others to be happy. And then he goes on to say, so long as you are not able to switch your self-cherishing attitude or your happiness with the suffering of others, leave alone reaching Buddhahood, even in this cycle of existence, you'll not have happiness. And so we can understand, we can see that attachment, anger, and so forth, these negative emotions bring about suffering. And so, with regard to quantum physics, the understanding of quantum physics is also quite helpful. Of course, what happens is we cling to what appears to us. We believe in the appearance and accordingly act, and that it brings about problems. But without doing that, without believing in the appearance and then clinging to that appearance, we will not have those kind of emotions, negative emotions. So in quantum physics, they say that things do not have any objective existence. So the appearance is not the way things are. Because if you delve into things, anything, and dissect it into its smaller parts, down to the atoms and so forth, nothing stands as being this and that. And they say that as long as there is an observer, there's an observed object. And without an observer, you cannot talk about anything as being observed object. And so, in quantum physics, what they say is we should not believe in the appearance, but go to the reality, find the reality, and search for the reality. And so, this kind of understanding and insight, what can this help in countering our negative emotions? This is said very clearly in Master Nagarjuna's text. He says that because of our inappropriate attention or mentation, we develop the negative emotions like attachment and clinging and anger and so forth. Whereas when you actually search for the reality of the thing, there's nothing that can be left, that is left there, which can give rise to our attachment and anger and so forth. And so, so our disturbance of our emotions, our mind, happens due to attachment, anger, and so forth, and they in turn are based on this inappropriate mentation, which in turn is rooted in clinging to some kind of an independent nature of things. So in essence, all of us in the world are same in wanting happiness and not wanting suffering, and therefore to increase what we want, happiness, and to decrease what we don't want, unhappiness or suffering, we need